Gospel Tangents is supported by users like you. Please support us at gospeltangents.com or on Patreon. Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology, and first daily Mormon history podcast. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with sociologist Dr. Ryan Cragun from the University of Tampa. In our next conversation, we're going to tackle the idea of whether there was a third Great Awakening in the 20th century. We'll also talk about why churches grow in the global South and why conservative religions grow. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. You know, we talked a little bit about the rise of the nuns. Mm-hmm. I recently talked to Matt Bowman.
Okay.
And one of the things that he said, and I think I asked you this at SSSR, yeah, but I want to ask it again.
Sure.
He said that there's a rise in people who are like into astrology and New Age religion. Do you agree with that?
No, not at all. Sorry, Matt. I love Matt. Nice guy. I think he's wrong on that. There's a great sociologist. His name's Steve Bruce. He's from the UK, and he wrote like the worst titled book I think I've ever read. It's the Westernization of the Easternization of the West, right? I think that's roughly what the title is, which is just terrible. But basically what he's arguing is we've got a lot of people, he's using the UK, right? But we can use the US as a comparative case. In the UK, lots of people are leaving religion, right? They're now at above 50%. So more than 50% of British people have no religious affiliations, even higher in Scotland. But lots of people are leaving. And lots of people have then come out and said, oh, they're all becoming spiritual, right? They're turning to New Age spirituality.
Yeah, spiritual but not religious.
Yes, it's that SB&R category, right? So spiritual but not religious. And
that wouldn't be in the nun category, or would it?
It would, actually.
It would be.
Yeah, so they would still be counted in the nun category because they don't have a religious affiliation. That's all that category means is I don't have a religious affiliation. So if you're identifying as spiritual, that's fine. So what he did is he said, okay, well, what a lot of people are claiming is like, oh, there's like this innate sense that I have to have something. And so they leave religion, organized formal religion, but then they find something else, right? So maybe it's crystals or maybe it's, who knows what it is.
Tarot cards,
right? Something like that. So they're finding these things and they're offsetting the religion with kind of the more diffuse, non-hierarchical Wicca, witchcraft, new agey religions. So he actually looked, right? He's like, okay, how many people are doing yoga and how many people are doing all of these things? The number of people who do it on a regular basis, right? Let's say it's crystals or tarot or astrology or something like that. It's pretty flat, right? There hasn't been like this dramatic uptick that's like, oh, I'm not, a member of the Church of England anymore, therefore I must practice tarot. It's straight up like, oh, I'm not a member of the Church of England anymore, and I'm nothing, right? And those things, not really interesting. He then goes on, and this is why the book is titled that way, to say the vast majority of people who do yoga do it for exercise, not because they're now converts to the specific subset of Hinduism, and they're like, I really believe all of the tenets of this. They're like, yoga is good exercise, right? So it's the westernization of the easternization of the West, right? They've basically westernized all of these kind of religious elements that have come to the West, like meditation, right? Or mindfulness, yoga, all of those things now we just basically treat as like health stuff, right? So you're doing things for your health. No one's like, okay, I'm going to practice mindfulness, therefore I'm a Buddhist, and therefore I'm going to, follow all of the teachings. Like, no one's doing that. So even if there is like a little uptick in meditation, it's not dramatic, and the vast majority of people who are doing it because it's good for your health, not because they're like, I am now converting to some new agey religion. We're just not seeing that massive offset, right? What I don't want to give the impression of, so I'm trying to be accurate here, it's not that non-religious people don't believe in some of these things, okay? Some of them do, absolutely. Some of them believe in aliens. Some of them believe in tarot, right? That's true for all groups of people. We actually don't see a huge difference between religious and non-religious people in their paranormal beliefs, which is kind of surprising. Now, if you take the subset of atheists, that's a very different group. They are much less likely to hold paranormal beliefs. But if we're just looking at non-religious people generally, people who say they have no religious affiliation, they're about equally likely as people with a religious affiliation to hold paranormal beliefs. Just not a big difference there. But we're not seeing a massive uptick. It's not like everybody's turning to spirituality. There's no reason to believe that people are innately spiritual and that they have to have this. Just there's no evidence to support that.
Interesting. I've talked with some other people about spirituality and religious affiliation can rise and fall. The first Great Awakening was in the 1700s. Joseph Smith was part of the second. And I've asked if there's been a third one from, say, 1940s, 1950s to 1980s. Would you think there's a third? Would you call that a third Great Awakening?
No.
Okay.
I probably wouldn't. What happened?
Because it seems like there was a rise in religious affiliation.
Yeah. So in my next book that's coming out in October.
Oh, nice. So another interview.
Probably. Happy to do that. We're looking at people who leave religion in the U.S., right? So it's me and Jesse Smith, it's the University of Western Michigan. But we're looking just generally. So it's not any specific religion, just religion generally. But we talk about this specific time period, 40s through the 80s roughly, and what was going on. And people, I mean, it's fascinating in my mind. People seem to miss like the clearly obvious thing that was happening during that period. It was the Cold War, right? Well, in the U.S., who were we fighting during the Cold War?
The Soviets.
The godless communists.
Right.
Right? So if they're the godless, and I'm emphasizing this on purpose, the godless communists, who do we have to be? Right? A lot of people don't realize when we put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. That was in the 1950s, right? That wasn't there when the Pledge of Allegiance was first created, right? When did we put in God we trust on our currency?
In the 50s.
In the 1950s.
Eisenhower.
Why did we do this? To make it so we were not the godless communists, right?
Well, Eisenhower even joined a church because he became president.
Yes, right. We were constructing this identity in the U.S. that opposed the godless communists. So we had a lot of emphasis on religion during that time period. We were pushing this. We are not them, and in order to not be them, we have to be religious and democratic, right? So we push that rhetoric really hard. And then what happens, I gave this number earlier in the interview, right? In 1990, Soviet Union collapses, right? And it's almost immediately after that. Now people can say, because all the way through that period, I don't know how old you are, Rick. I think you're a little older than I am, but we're probably close in age, right? I remember it well enough, but I don't remember this kind of stuff happening. I grew up in a Mormon enclave in Utah. If you were, in the, let's say 1970s, if you came out and said, I'm an atheist, guess what the immediate next question was? Are you also a communist, right?
Okay.
Today, if somebody comes out as an atheist, is anybody then going to immediately say, are you a communist, right? That splits in 1990. In 1990,
well, wait a minute. All the Birchers thought Eisenhower was a communist. He believed in God.
Right. Atheist usually gets, it's thrown around. But that splits, right? So the attitudes towards communists. We still don't love communists here in the U.S., right? But atheism is now not as widely kind of pilloried. People are like, whatever, right? Like you do you, it doesn't matter. But people don't immediately then assume that you're a communist, right? So it became much safer to be like, you know what? I'm not religious. And no one's going like, oh, you're communist, right? Now they're just like, I'm just not religious. And they're like, okay, that's fine. Like, be not religious.
So I want to make sure I understand this. So, I mean, you're putting this in Cold War terms, which I think is interesting.
Right.
But wasn't there a rise in religious affiliation? I mean, at least in the LDS Church, there sure was.
I mean, there was growth. There was growth around the world. And my first paper in Social Religion actually tackles that, right? So the LDS Church, which is tricky, right? It grows at very specific times in economic development around the world. Okay. So, and I probably should know more about your background, right? Did you serve a mission?
I did.
Yeah, where'd you serve?
South Carolina.
South Carolina. Okay. In that very first paper, I should remember what year it was published, like 2011 or something. But it's in Social Religion. I'm looking at the Human Development Index. So this is the level of development of a country and growth rates. And I'm looking for Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Seventh-day Adventists. For Mormons...
Is that because they have good numbers or the best numbers?
They do have good numbers, right? And we also kind of argue that there are 3 American originals that all proselytize.
Okay.
So they do proselytize, right? Catholic Church doesn't really proselytize, right? So it's trickier for some of those. But all 3 of them proselytize, so it makes it easy, and they care about their numbers, right? So they report numbers, we can get access to them, so we can use those. So I'm comparing all 3 of them, and what you see is the LDS Church grows in countries where the HDI, which ranges from 0, like no one can read, everybody's dead, and like, you know, it's really bad, to 1, right? Which is, I'm trying to remember all the numbers. I think it's per capita GDP. I'm not going to remember all this. I should.
HDI stands
Human
for
Development Index.
Okay.
So it's literacy rates. I remember that for sure. It's life expectancy. That's also in there. And I forget the third one. It's three variables that get combined. And 1 would be like everybody can read, everybody lives, you know, a really long time, and I think it's per capita GDP is really high. So you have that range, right? The lowest countries still today are in like the 0.3 range, which means things are bad, right? A lot of people can't read, life expectancy is short, there are lots of problems. Most of the highly developed countries, your Scandinavian countries, even the US, Australia, Japan, for instance,
Europe.
They're all 0.9s, right? They're above 0.9. And so what we saw in there is Mormons have the highest growth, somewhere between like 0.6 and 0.8, and above about 0.85, their growth plummets, just drops off. So once countries hit a certain level of economic development and human development, they just lose interest in religion. Just goes away, right? So that's what we argue in there. Now, Seventh-day Adventists, they grow at a lower HDI because of their approach. They go in and set up hospitals and schools in places that don't have this, right? So they'll go in earlier and they'll actually get a lot of growth when countries are still kind of lower on that scale. Jehovah's Witnesses are about the same as Mormons. They grow about the same place. But this also reflects, where we send missionaries, right? So we will send some missionaries to slightly more rural areas, but when we're going into a country for the first place, where do we send the missionaries? The biggest cities around, right? We send them into the most developed places. So the way that the LDS Church kind of functions that way is they're looking for places that are developing, right? But once you hit a certain level of development, one of my good friends served in the Netherlands, right? He had 0. I think he had 1 convert in 2 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she was an immigrant. So it's just like, you're just not going to have any success in these highly developed countries. People have lost interest in religion. It just doesn't matter to them anymore. Right? They've got all of their, we call this existential security. Their existential security is covered. They don't need religion for this. It's only in the countries that are developing where you actually see growth. And this is exactly what we see today with the LDS Church. Where are they growing?
Africa.
Everybody knows
South
this, right?
America.
Well, and even South America, that's it's like pockets now, right? Chile's pretty well developed. They're seeing no growth. They're seeing reversals in Chile now, right? So there are some pockets in South America where they're still growing, but a lot of places, growth has just stopped, right? It's over. So really the only place where you see a lot of Mormon growth, Africa, right? Are they developing countries within that range? Strangely, that's what I predicted more than a decade ago. That's exactly where they're seeing the growth.
That's really interesting because I saw a Facebook post recently from one of my Community of Christ friends. Mm-hmm. And he was kind of ripping on the LDS Church. The LDS Church needs to ordain women and allow more LGBT and, all these progressive things.
Got it.
And I said, well, wait a minute. Community of Christ does all that. Their growth is even worse than the LDS.
Yeah, they're not growing.
And where are they growing? Africa.
Same places.
Haiti.
Sure, yeah. Because they're not going to grow in developed countries. Developed countries have just lost interest in religions. There's no growth there.
Do you see that continuing on? Is this because I still want to see, even if you don't want to call 50s through the 80s a third Great Awakening, right. Isn't there one on the horizon? Isn't it just cyclical where we have growth? Sure. And I talked to Christina Rossetti. She said, the Puritans came from England and that kind of fueled the first Great Awakening, but then where are the Puritans? Like, they're gone.
Yeah,
like nobody's a Puritan anymore. And so she says, when you're going through these, some groups are going to disappear, like the Puritans. Mm-hmm. And so can't you argue that this is a cyclical thing and that there's going to be another, there's going to be a new Billy Graham in 2040 or something, and he's going to bring everybody in. And what do you think?
Sure. So this is fun, right? We can wrestle with this. Sociologists wrestled with this. Starting in the late 80s and early 90s, there was kind of a wave among sociologists of religion called the religious economies model, right? And this is argued by people like Rodney Stark and Larry Iannacone and Roger Finke. And then it kind of culminated in this book in 2001 called Acts of Faith. And basically what they argue is very similar, that religion is cyclical. Okay. So their argument is what happens in any given country is like one religion will become dominant. So that religion, it'll grow, right? Gets lots of members, whether it's by force or fiat or just because they're really successful. But as they get big and dominant and become a monopoly, they become lazy. Religious economies, right? So they become lazy. Once they become lazy, they're not putting all the effort in to like keep religiosity up. And then some other competitor is going to sneak in and they're going to outcompete them, right? So when the monopolies get big and they get lazy, you see a decline in religiosity, and then the competitors come in and they drive that back up, right? So they push it back up, and then you see an uptick. And then, of course, that new competitor eventually grows and becomes a monopoly. They get lazy. And so they argue that this is cyclical, right? And that was a really popular idea for like 15 years in the sociology of religion. But foundational to this is an assumption, right? So we build theory in sociology where you have these like foundational assumptions, and then you have kind of propositions and you build up from there. Their assumption, and they lay this out very clearly, is that humans have an innate need for religion, okay? That they argue that every human on the planet is worried about death and what's going to happen after death. And as a result, we all have an innate need for religion. No, we don't. That's the easy answer for this, right? Their foundational assumption is just wrong, right? And as, you know, almost 1 billion people on the planet today indicate, we don't have that foundational need, right? If you raise people without religion, they will not invent it, right? You have to give them religion. You have to teach religion. Religion is not something that's innate to humans. It's something that's taught to humans. So their foundational assumption was flawed from the beginning, right? You don't have to have religion. There are plenty of people who are like, nope. So they kind of thought that demand for religion was going to be constant, but supply was going to vary, right?
Okay.
That works if demand is constant. Demand isn't constant, right? So the religious economies model is just fundamentally flawed. And now I think almost all of the sociologists of religion around the world, the Europeans that whole time, because religion was declining in Europe all the way through from the 40s through the 60s through the 80s. It was still declining, right? So they're looking at the US and they're like, what is wrong with you guys, right? Can you not see outside your doorstep, right? Like look beyond the US. And they're like, no, the US is like, that's all we care about. The religious economies model was based only on the US, right? Where that kind of slight uptick during the 40s, 50s, 60s through the 80s. There was a little bit of an uptick in terms of like how important religion was, but now it's gone, right? Like that's totally gone. Religion's declining and it's going to continue down that path. I would be probably pretty stupid, right? To come out and say religion is going to disappear, right? Everybody who's ever done that, they've had to eat crow. Now, most of them have been dead when they had to eat crow, right? So like, so be it. But it's just it's a really bad kind of argument to say like, oh, definitively, right? Religion is going to die. The current trends suggest that things are going to continue the way they are. Can I project into the future? You know, I'm not going to prophesy here. That's not what I do.
This sounds like the stock market. Past
growth is no predictor of future growth, right? That said, unless things radically change, and in my latest book, right, Beyond Doubt, The Secularization of Society, we lay this out and say, look, it could absolutely change. There are certain things that could reverse these trends. If those don't happen, there's no reason to think that this is going to go any other direction than down. And once people go secular, they're very unlikely to go back, right? In that latest paper that we published, we talked about in Utah in particular, members of the LDS Church only retain about 2/3 of their kids. So they're losing about 1/3 of their members. The group that's retaining the most, those who are raised with no religion. They're now retaining more than 70% of their offspring, right? So people who are raised without religion today in Utah in particular, they're far more likely than almost every other religious group to retain their young. Once you go secular, you don't go back.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Ryan Cragun from the University of Tampa. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about the role of religion and politics, and we'll talk about a paper that he did on women and priesthood.
Right? For members of the church, are they more likely to think that the second coming is going to happen before women are going to get the priesthood? And it turns out they are, which is mind-blowing, right? For kind of those of us who are doing this research, we're like, really?
Jesus is going to institute.
Yes, right. You really think that Jesus is more likely to return than women are going to get the priesthood. And that's actually what we showed in the paper.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.